Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of the Product Development Podcast, which I recorded with Gisela Rossi back in June 2023. The original recording was audio only, but due to demand, I've put these sessions into video format for YouTube. In the future, you'll start seeing video recordings of the actual interviews themselves as well, so make sure to subscribe to see more content like this in the future, as well as the video versions of the interviews. Hope you enjoyed this episode with Gisela Rossi on all things minimum viable product. Welcome to the Product Development Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Wakeling, a product manager passionate about enriching my own understanding of how great products are made. In this episode, I speak with Gisela Rossi, an engineering leadership professional who has previously worked as a software engineer at a number of tech companies and moved into engineering management and currently working with HSBC. She's also a public speaker on a wide range of topics on engineering and leadership and is an active member within the Python community, acting as mentor for a number of people. Gisela, it's great to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Adam. It's great to be here with you.
So some of the areas I'd like to cover today are, I think, firstly, looking at what a great engineering manager and product owner / product manager relationship looks like in a business or on a particular project. Then I'd like to dig a bit into what are the dynamics of a successful team from your perspective. And then from there, we'll go and look at the main topic of today, which is around what makes a great minimum viable product or MVP and how to successfully iterate upon them. So lots to cover, and I'm sure will be some interesting tangents along the way. But starting from the very first point there, what comes to your mind when you think about what a great engineering and product relationship looks like? Maybe both at the team level, but also the individual roles, which I kind of mentioned there.
I think that's a great question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that different organizations structure work differently. And in some of them, you may have at each cross-functional team level a product manager and an engineer manager. And in some others, you won't. But I think in all companies, you probably will have some sort of this mix at some level with some interaction. So I think the points are still valid to consider anyway. I think the main thing that will come to mind when thinking about this relationship is trust and how important it is to have that trust between the people doing these two very key roles. If that trust in the other person and their motives and on what they go and do after you spoke to them is not there, there is no process or guidance or tech that is going to save you. But if that trust is there, then everything else is something you can work on and iterate and improve, and it will get better and better with time as you work on it. That brings me to my second point that I think about, which is communication, like with any other member of the team, but even maybe more than with other relationships, because I think the engineer manager and the product manager have to be constantly in sync and doing that iteration to optimize for the team to be going in the right direction, right? Is that metaphor of the leader putting the ladder against the right walls? Otherwise, you may be moving tremendously fast, but in the wrong direction. And I think that it is something that can happen quite quickly in organizations that move fast if those two roles are not aligned constantly. I personally, for example, one of my favorite relationships in the past with a product manager, we used to have daily things together, even before the team stand up. It would help us also speak of maybe problems we had noticed on the team dynamics, or if we had noticed someone was struggling with something and we could help, or if we were talking, for example, about something regarding stakeholder that was maybe not as public at the team level. I think having that space to meet regularly and tackle things in time is quite key. And if I had to pick a third thing, for me, it would be to be clear in which is the separation of responsibilities. I think that can get sometimes a bit diluted, but because in a way you have to care about the other part. So if you are, for example, a product manager, you have to care about how things are going to be delivered. You have to understand why things are taking a certain amount of time and what the trade-offs are. And similarly, if you're an engineering manager, you have to understand what's the business driver for the things you're building, what's the reason, why it's going to be successful and how. But then it's also good to go back to your basis and understand if we disagree, this is your call.
Mm.
In this remit, this is your call if we disagree, and that is fair play.
Mm. So trust, communication, and essentially, I suppose, engineering thinking a little bit like product, and product thinking a little bit like engineering in terms of understanding, caring, as you said, how things should be done. And I think fundamentally the engineering manager, let's say in this case, knowing the why and that the vision has been articulated from product effectively so that everyone's on the same page. They're moving in the right direction, as you said. It sounds like, I think if you hit those three things, I'm sure you're on a good way in terms of delivering a successful project, I'm sure.
And that separation of responsibilities as well,
Mm.
just to hammer on that, because it will happen at some point that you may not be on the same page about priorities, but if you know who has the lead on certain areas of the decisions, I think that also helps
Mm.
to align quickly.
So point for clear accountability as well. I just on the first point around trust, I remember reading a book a couple of years ago called "The Five Dysfunctions of a Team." I can't remember the author, so forgive me, but it's like a pyramid of a great team, and the bottom layer was trust, or absence of trust, should I say? And the idea is you can't elevate a team to a successful team unless you get past the first layer of the pyramid, which in this case was absence of trust.
Yeah,
And I guess without that sort of trust, you conceal weaknesses and mistakes, and I think that's what it mentions in the book around jumping to conclusions on certain things and poor communication. To your other point as well, so yeah, I think absence of trust is
absolutely.
huge. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it creates a lot of ripple effects. For example, I think teams that don't have trust very quickly become places that are unpleasant to work, where people don't feel safe to voice their ideas if they don't agree with something, where people feel afraid to make mistakes and take less risks, which is equivalent to say that they are less ambitious, because being ambitious involves taking risks every step of the way. So you're really going against yourself as you set up those sorts of fixed mindset teams in which vulnerability is not allowed, making mistakes is not allowed, or is ridiculed or frowned upon. So the basis to not have that is to have that trust, and then that understanding that everyone is waking up in the morning and saying, I'm going to do my best today.
Mm. So if you're a manager of a team and you've observed that maybe the team members aren't trusting each other for whatever reason, you can't work out why, but what other sort of tactics maybe could a manager do on a team, would you say, that maybe could help rebuild trust if it's not there, or either it was lost maybe, or it was never there to begin with?
That's a very good question. I have come across this in my teams, and I think it depends where the source of the issue is. There is one case that is common and is all very well intentioned people. Someone may have said something, I don't know, that is rude, or maybe it was misinterpreted or something, and that starts to break things, and then it escalates. And I think that is one of the ones that ideally I think it should be tackled early and not let it fester. And speak to the people, maybe reflect on it at a retro if you do that kind of ceremonies. If you don't, maybe you can set up a special chat. I find that those things can spread and ruin the mood of a team quite quickly. One problem I would say is way bigger is when that trust is not there because there are some serious issues. So this could be active discrimination against a team member, or someone being having like a sort of rock star personality
Mm.
of like, I'm the best. And in these cases it's more delicate. On the one hand, I guess you have to see what you can do regarding company policy, but I personally would say that it's good to take that person aside and talk about what is a good practice within their team, and talk about these kind of things, about how to foster like a community mentality where everyone can have a learning journey and everyone
Mm.
can feel valued. And I think it becomes a bit also about maybe protecting those that have been discriminated against. It boils down to what are the attitudes of the people in the team, and understanding who do you have in the team, what moves them, what do they believe in. Do they believe, for example, that some people are inherently better than others, or do they believe that we are all here to learn and that we all may have good days and bad days? And kind of understanding how do people come to think about this, and and maybe try to talk to them if they may have that kind of fixed mindset, and try to bring them along the journey of, well, maybe we can look at this in another way, another way that help us all grow faster and better. That comes again when you think about hiring and you think about building teams, and it becomes the same delicate topic. Who am I going to introduce to this team, and what does this team need? And then, like, in there, protecting that trust and that environment that you have produced, at the same time challenging that team, right? And making sure they are high performing, but making them high performing requires you to protect that learning environment. It's a bit of going against like the superstar, rock star mindset.
It's interesting as well, because the second layer of the pyramid in the 5 dysfunctions of a team is around fear of conflict. And it's kind of an interesting one there in itself, because obviously you talk about the rock stars and maybe they are kind of very pro-conflict. But even though the others, because they don't trust the other people, they can't go back to them and kind of give them what they've received, I suppose, in that sense. And but you need that two-way dynamic, right, in the teams, I guess. So fear of conflict
Yeah,
is
but
an
I think
interesting
it's
one.
interesting because I think like sometimes, as it may be because they don't want to delegate, but it also sometimes comes from a place of feeling their own position threatened. So in that way, conflict may be, as you say, a question of what if I'm wrong, and we debate and I'm wrong, and how would that affect my position? And I think that is something that, that's kind of like a disease that one has to try to combat within the teams, and trying to make people feel that, you're going to be valued even if you're wrong. Your position won't be compromised. It's just a question of giving other people space as well to say something, and to work towards those goals too.
How else can you be really well aligned in terms of outside just those one-to-one meetings once a day, or however, whatever the velocity is that you do that on? What are some tactics you can do in terms of improving that product engineering communication and alignment, I suppose?
I think one thing that helps is to share as much information as you can, and to share it in a language that is understandable and digestible by the other person. So, for example, as an engineer manager, I would share technical details with my product manager, but I wouldn't expect them to know the full extent of, for example, a production bug that we are fixing. I wouldn't expect that from them, and unless they are curious and they really want to learn and they want to ask me more, and then it's fine. But I understand it's not part of the role, but they still need to know what's going on, and roughly what the problem has been, and what the solution is going to be. And I think in that, from the engineering function to the product function, one key skill for me from an engineer manager or an engineer director is to be able to go up one or two abstraction layers above what you would work as an engineer, or what you discuss with your engineers, and talk at that level, and be able to say, these are the trade-offs, this was the decision on implementation side, and so on. And I think that carries more value than when I have seen communications that go on the line of, oh yeah, we are working on it.
Mm.
And that for me would be a very bad update. For example, you're having a sync, but it's not a very valuable one. And same, I have seen, like, from the product side, very valuable updates that have to do with giving a lot of details of, these were the company metrics, let me pull them for you. This is how I made the decision that this is going to be the priority. This is what I look at. This is what I prioritize. I think the more data you can include, and the more people like to know why we are going in the direction we are going. And I think that those are the kind of valuable, meaty updates that I would like to see for that communication to be successful.
So, minimum viable product. In your view, the minimum viable product, or MVP, what is that fundamentally? How would you define that? Because I think a lot of people think they know what an MVP is, but not necessarily do an MVP when they think they are, or or maybe are doing it and maybe not particularly well. So fundamentally, how would you describe the MVP?
I think for me is something that has to be answering some very key business questions. And it has to answer it with the least amount of effort possible. So, for example, if you are thinking about if I build this, will people be interested? And maybe I've seen examples of people building just the front with a button, and when people go clicking the button, there is nothing, and it just shows an error. But you can measure how many people clicked, and
That little trick.
I think like depends what you're trying, to measure. It will impact what that minimum looks like for you to achieve it. But I think is one thing that I think has come to my attention is that it requires a lot of willpower to hold back from adding things that are nice to have or that could wait for another iteration. Usually MVPs have to look a bit rough and they have to look a bit unfinished. I don't know. I think ideally you want your MVP to fall short up to an extent. You want people to complain that it's not powerful enough and big enough and fast enough and that it crashes, because that means that you probably did build the minimum and that you have demand. So you have answered the question, you have answered the business question that do we have demand for this or not? And now you can iterate in the engineering side and build something good to meet that demand with exactly the things that you are seeing. I would say that fundamentally it has to be answering very key business questions, and that is kind of the first step. And then you have to trim it and trim it and trim it until you're sure you have that minimum.
So that trimming process then, if we talk about that, is that at the time of conception of the idea, the scope writing, is it during the build? Where is that trimming part of the execution in that kind of timeline as opposed of idea to launch?
Yeah, I think once you have a question you want to answer from the business point of view, I don't know, for example, will adding this page will increase our revenue, our sales? Then you have to think, okay, how do I answer that question? To answer that, a lot of ideas will come into the table. You will probably consult a lot of people that are valuable, whose expertise you care, and they will bring a lot of ideas. But then you will find that if you want to build all of that, you will find that you probably don't have the budget or it will take a lot of time. It may take you, I don't know, half a year to get to a vision that satisfies all of the things that were put on the table. And that means half a year before you have been able to answer your original question of there is demand for this or not. Half a year where you are spending money without really knowing if you will get it back. So basically, I think it's about how do I shorten that cycle? Can I build something in 3 months that answers the same question? Okay, maybe I have to remove this functionality over here. Maybe I have to hard code this part. Maybe I have to reuse this model that was thought for something else and is terrible and it has a lot of tech debt, but I don't know, it will do for now. And you think about ideas which can be hacks from a technical point of view, or it can be reduction on scope from a business side, and you trim it both ways. So you trim it from the business side and you trim it from the engineering side all you can, and maybe you reduce it to 2 months, and maybe now you can answer your business question in 2 months. So you spend 2 months of money instead of 6 to answer that question. And for me, there is a lot of value in that.
In the last episode of the podcast, I spoke to Chris Clinton, who is the co-founder of Knack Cyber, a cybersecurity sort of SaaS product. And in the early days of the company, when they were essentially developing their MVP, what they did was, as you kind of alluded to there, a lot of manual work. Things were either hard coded or even in his case, the dashboard they built was essentially just a PowerPoint presentation that they sent to clients initially with key data on there. And they sent it to that, got feedback. Okay, this is good, this isn't good. And then actually then did the coding at that point. And likewise, I think his co-founder was a GDPR lawyer. And technically their selling point is this automated kind of documents gathered for people. And of course, she was writing them behind the scenes herself without, and then giving that to clients. And eventually, obviously, that was automated. But it's a really interesting idea of that, the trimming sense of, okay, what is actually essential to spend development money on in terms of, let's say, developers actually building what can be manually done by people doing stuff themselves, whether it's writing or whatever else. So yeah, but in terms of iteration, obviously, because once you launch the MVP and let's say it is that nicely trimmed version that generates demand, at that point when you start thinking about iterations, what is it there that you need to really think about in particular? Because maybe you can make the same mistakes as you would with an MVP and over-engineer that too much as well. So, what is your approach when it comes to that?
I think in that moment you already have a lot more data than you had on the first go because you, as you said before, for example, you show it to some clients and they told you, "Oh, I really like this part of the dashboard." And it's funny you say dashboard because one of my previous job, we work on some very cool dashboard too for clients and the data, and I remember that project very fondly. And that it was, for example, a good example of something like that you were mentioning around clients having a very clear feedback of where their attention was going. And even if it wasn't direct feedback of the dashboard, but they could say something like, "Oh my God, that number looks super high. What is that?" Which means it got their eye, whereas some other things maybe weren't commented, and that is feedback too. And I think in that moment you have more data to iterate on. So if you have data on what things were not clear and you can expand, you have data on things people would like to see and that weren't there. You have data on performance behind the scenes. From a technical point of view, you have data on crashes, on production bugs, on response time, on security, on tech debt. You have a lot of data by that point. And that's where a good relationship between product and engineering comes to the job and rescue, because after the MVP, you have to think, well, now I have to actually build a thing. And maybe it's not an extension of the MVP because the MVP was built rashly, and maybe that is something I just discard and I build this
Mm.
well from scratch, knowing exactly what features I have to build. And sometimes it's good enough that you can extend from it and doesn't have crippling tech debt. So I think at that moment it depends, but you already have a lot more tools and data to back your path.
It's interesting point around the starting from scratch potentially, even if it was successful. I think maybe you have the elements of you launch an MVP and you've invested a lot of time and effort into it, and just the thought of destroying all the code base, whatever it is, and saying, "Yeah, that's great, prove the concept. Now let's rebuild it properly," or with more engineering going into it, etc.
I think that's a great way to see that learning mentality. Okay, I use this, I learned a lot from both the product side and the engineering side. And now with all that knowledge that I learned, I can do it in a fraction of the time and better.
How much input would the engineering manager have in terms of gauging whether it's successful or not?
I've had different experiences in the past. So I have worked in companies where direction was mandated top down quite heavily. Even the product within at the team level didn't have a lot of say. Everything kind of came from higher above. But I have also worked at companies where teams had more freedom and they could decide at the team level, I think this is the right way to go. And at that point, it was more within that relationship of engineer manager, product manager, where you can have more of a say. I think in terms of how much is metrics and how much is someone's decision, maybe out of a gut feeling or vision. And in this way, if I have to be honest, I think I have seen it more guided out of vision than metrics. Even though I think a lot of companies do want to do metrics, I think metrics sometimes come after those MVPs are done. I think they come after a few iterations, actually. Something I have noticed is that usually there is someone's vision, which is what motivates maybe the creation of a company or a product. And after a couple of iterations, it has been successful up to a certain extent. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. And at that point, maybe the organization grows, teams start to form, and people in teams come with experience and they say, we need metrics to guide what we're doing. And then metrics start to show up and start to be created and good metrics, and you start to improve your metrics over time. and you start to put some numbers around that vision. But that is realistically how I have seen it in the past. I'm not saying it's the best way. It's just my personal experience, how I have seen it. If there are any founders out there that started with metrics from scratch, please ping me on Twitter or LinkedIn, because I love those stories. I think like from a theoretical point of view, I think starting with metrics would be super effective way of doing it. In a way of maybe optimizing resources in a time of crisis.
Touching on that, obviously now we're in a quite difficult macroeconomic place in most countries in the world. Things are not as rosy as they were maybe a few years ago. Budgets are a lot tighter. Obviously, there are a number of companies, particularly in tech, with a lot of layoffs. Not necessarily for poor performance reasons, but it's just mass layoffs everywhere. So, with leaner teams, maybe delivering projects and MVPs. What are some things that people can think about in terms of, I suppose, projects in the current state of things? Is it different to what it was a couple of years ago from your perspective? Maybe not a couple of years
Short
ago,
answer,
because
yes.
maybe a few years ago is probably better time point.
Yeah, short answer, yes. I think we are in a very different landscape than we were a few years ago regarding just how money flows across tech organizations and how they can choose to use it. In terms of how that affects building products, or how that could affect building products, my first thought actually is that even though it's something that is super hard from an individual point of view, and I'm not saying this from a high horse, the company I was working at last year collapsed and I lost my job. But in a way, I think also that crisis is a cleansing of all products that maybe had not market fit in the first place. And I think maybe it can also generate new ideas that have better market fit, because it being a focus now much more than it was before. I think I start to see a drive for fixing issues that people have now, versus building something and maybe hoping that in the future I will be able to find an ideal client for my product. So I think in that sense, I think the space for tech companies is changing, and I think it's becoming, more competitive to get funding, which means less ideas get built. But also I think there is a focus on ideas that feel like they are must and not a nice to have in people's lives. So I think I have seen more of a shift towards security or health or sectors that are a bit like that. I feel really bad for how it has impacted the livelihood of a lot of people. Trying to look for a silver lining, I think it could potentially mean companies that are more impactful and that leave a mark in the world that is bigger. But yeah, that is me trying also to find a silver lining to what has been a quite a difficult time for a lot of friends. And
It's interesting point you raise around the product market fit, and I'm sure there's many cases where a lot of venture capital money was just thrown into a few ideas that people thought was a good idea but didn't have that product market fit, as you mentioned in the last podcast as well. To make reference to that again, Chris actually mentioned, I've got an app idea for that crowd. I think the idea was, people just thought, I can build an app about that thing. That'll work. And of course, all this money thrown into it. But fundamentally, as you said, there wasn't a problem to solve, wasn't monetizable, and many just ended up in the dust, as it were. So on the MVP side, then, let's say you have something that does have product market fit, and in terms of the delivery, making sure it stays on course. We haven't really talked too much about the way things are delivered, let's say. So obviously some companies have delivery managers dedicated to making sure that things move along, but a lot of people don't have that as a kind of resource internally. So what are
and
some
I'm not
things
sure
that
I would recommend it either, if I'm honest.
Yeah. What is the kind of the approach from your side in terms of ensuring that a project has good execution in lieu of a dedicated delivery manager or a project manager, let's say, as well?
Yeah, I think there are two things on that I have, tactics that I have used and seen work well. One is that I think everyone on the team has to be aware which is the vision you're working towards, which are the goals you're trying to hit, what is important, why is important that you hit them. If you are talking about an MVP, for example, at a startup, you also have the motivation for money that they are early investors in a way too. So people will be already intrinsically very motivated to make that work. So it's just a question of providing them with a vision. Because I think sometimes when people think about execution, they think about engineers as some people that just code. But I don't think about it that way. I think is if people know your vision and they know what you want to achieve, they can help you get there faster. So, for example, they will be able to say, hey, I know you asked me to do this, but actually I realize this will take X amount of time. And what about we do it this way? And I have seen that happen. I have seen engineers propose to the product manager solutions that were actually better and cheaper. And there is nothing. That's not to say the product manager was a bad product manager. As I said, it's just this interaction that is so rich between, okay, this is the vision, this is my idea, and then people start iterating on that, and sometimes they realize, oh, there is an optimization here that we can make, or a small change. What do you think of this? So I think getting everyone to understand what you're trying to do and where you're trying to get to will get you there faster, because you will have everyone's mind working on it. The other thing I think helps to keep teams on track is to have processes. I mean, I think it's old in a way to say it, but you need to have some sort of process to track what are the things you're trying to get to. Like, you can use OKRs, you can use a myriad of different systems, but you have to track which are your key goals. You have to sort them by priority, and then you have to track them, and you have to say, well, this one is behind by X number of weeks. How realistic is that we are going to hit it? Shall we reassess or not? Is it valuable if we add more resources or not? And keep a constant vigilance on that, which as an engineering manager I have done when I was engineering manager of just one team. And I think also I have done it side to side with my product manager. So I think that is something that can be a sort of joint responsibility. Even though the delivery at the end of the day is the responsibility of the engineer manager, I think is something that is good for the two of them to keep an eye. But I think those are the two things I would say. I don't think personally that you necessarily need a delivery manager. I think if the team already has a product manager and engineering manager, they can do that role successfully. And I think the other thing you need is to bring everyone on board on the vision of what you're trying to accomplish, the timelines, and get everyone's buy-in. Also, that's another thing. If you just, this is something I have seen not work, which is if you go with a plan that was thought and, oh, these are the deadlines, these are, and just give it to the team. And the team said, we are not going to be able to do this because of X, Y, and Z. There is already a problem, because you're getting immediate feedback that your plan is unrealistic. So I think also getting that buy-in gives you peace of mind that your plan is realistic, is executable, and if everything goes well, you will succeed at the end of the journey in having all the things you set out to do.
I just want to apologize to all delivery managers who happen to be listening to this podcast. But
yeah.
You mentioned around OKRs there as well as the kind of longer term metric to be tracking. What sort of metrics do they look like? Maybe you can give some examples to people.
Yeah, I think the value from OKRs or any system similar to it is that it gives you a way of writing your goals, understanding your goals, because writing is understanding. And it makes you also choose between different goals, because if you have 10 priorities, you really don't have priorities. So it makes you choose which are actually your priorities and what are the things you're happy to leave for later. And I think that is probably the hardest thing about OKRs, that usually it makes you come to terms with you're not going to be able to do everything. And these are the areas where we won't be making a dent this quarter, because we are going to be focusing on these other ones. And I think that is something that OKRs force you to come to terms with, because otherwise it all feels very plausible in your head that you're going to complete those 50 projects in 3 months. And and when you are faced with the reality of putting numbers next to it and estimates the engineers may give you and the teams may give you, it becomes very real very quickly that what is maybe ambitious but realistic. On the other hand, I think also OKRs help you have a shared vision across the organization. When you have an organization that is multiple teams, maybe multiple orgs with multiple teams inside, it's hard to know what the other teams are doing, how the company is thinking, and how your work may interact with the work of others. So the task of setting OKRs and going through that planning stage as a leader in particular, it really helps you to hone that shared vision of what you're trying to build in the next few months. And in terms of what is a good OKR, the thing I would say, it has to be something that you can measure and ideally something that is very concrete. So, for example, I don't know, increase the engagement in this product by X%. It's something that is that you know how you're going to measure it, you know the current number, and you know how much you need to dial that up or down. Or I think that kind of things. I think it's not always possible though, and I think that is where sometimes OKRs struggle a bit more. I think there are areas where it becomes just more convoluted to come up with numbers, especially when you think about things as tech debt or maybe rewrite of systems or things like that. It just becomes harder to measure than maybe something that is client facing.
What are the kind of mistakes maybe people could make during an MVP and iterations thereof? What are some common mistakes that maybe people can do, both from the engineering or maybe even your perceptions from the product side as well?
What I have seen from the product side that I think is quite dangerous is this idea that if you invested X amount of time or money building something, you have to take it all the way to the end, which is basically to say not pivoting early enough or often enough. So I think there is a psychological factor in there. I can't remember the psychological name of this, but basically when you invest money or effort or you're invested into something and it's very hard to give it up, even though you know you have to give it up.
Like sunk cost fallacy, I think, is that the phrase?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Thank you. Thank you. The name had escaped me for a second. Exactly that. And I think that is something that does happen in organizations. Sometimes organizations have a hard time just saying goodbye to things that just haven't worked.
Yeah, on my side, I've certainly worked on projects before where we created what the MVP was. At the time, it was essentially an aggregated data tool, is what we're trying to achieve. And we kind of proved that we could do it. It's just, it showed flaws in the data itself, which actually was, I suppose, successful, but also failed in that sense. And as a result, we didn't launch it live. But as a product manager, I on that project, I still wanted to release it. I still felt like it's there. I want to
What's your
deliver something. It was the
baby?
baby, yeah, exactly. And to your point, it is hard to sometimes to say no. Actually, we proved one thing, or we didn't prove it. Let it go, move on, or come back to it later once the other things are fixed, maybe potentially.
It's hard, and
Mm,
it happens to engineers too. I think in engineering, sometimes there is this thing about engineers write their code and they get attached to it and they feel very proud of it, and then maybe the company moves in a different direction, and that code just gets deprecated and never used again. Or they are asked to rewrite the whole thing
mm,
just because I don't know there was a change of priority somewhere, and sometimes that is something that I think before becoming a senior engineer, you probably have to come to peace with that.
mm.
Um, that your code is just a tool to get a job done. But I think it's also something that sometimes happens to engineers, and they can feel that their value was a bit diminished by it not being released.
So just to kind of wrap up things, maybe you can talk about your experience working as a mentor and working with maybe communities of enthusiastic people in a particular niche.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find it incredibly rewarding, and I think helping people achieve their potential have been one of the most rewarding things in my career. Mentoring others is a very important part of what everyone I think should be doing. I think everyone should be helping the next generation of people grow and trying to pass on what you have learned, that it have take you a few years to learn it. Maybe try to help other people learn it faster, so they will get to maybe other realizations faster than you will get. And I think that is sort of the spirit of mentoring and the spirit of those communities. I think it's also part of why I went into management and the manager path, or the organizational structure sort of things, where you can have a wider impact into initiatives to help people grow, setting the systems in place for people to be able to thrive and to progress and to reach their potential. Because I think it's the best thing you can do in an organization, to help the organization reach their potential by achieving their business goal, but also helping the members of the organization reach their potential by learning and improving and reaching those milestones. I had always a focus within that of underrepresented communities, because to be honest, I had a lot of not good experience, I would say, regarding discrimination. So I do want to help also other people overcome that and feel less alone, at the end of the day, less discouraged to maybe abandon their careers in technology because of that.
Hopefully some maybe some higher ups in the corporate ladder listening, or particularly underrepresented groups, might be inspired to become mentors themselves if they're not already, and give back, as it were, and sort of help those. And as you said, people who think maybe they can't reach those levels or whatever else can actually see it's possible, or have some of that guiding light, as it were, to gravitate towards that.
One thing I would say, though, is that even though I think mentorship is tremendously important, and you can help in a way when it's not even someone that is in your organization, when it's people within your organization, you can do so much more than mentoring. You can be a champion for them. You can speak for them when they are not in the room. You can help them get opportunities by raising their name at the right tables and speaking on their behalf of how good their work is, or how driven they are, or how much they want to learn. And I think this is sometimes an overlooked factor, because I think mentorship is great when it's someone, for example, not within your same sphere. So, for example, this example of someone trying to get into university, I have no way of championing this person to get that. But if it's someone, for example, trying to get a job, I could introduce them to my networks. I could help them in more active ways than just mentoring. And I think this is such a key element of also lifting people up, which I think is sometimes slightly overlooked, and I think is good to emphasize.
Well, I think that's a good place to finish up on as well. So, Gisela, thank you very much for joining the podcast. It's been really interesting. And if people are interested to find out more and in terms of what you're doing, where else can people find you?
Twitter, I'm quite active. LinkedIn, and I also have my own personal page, which you can find it linked on both my LinkedIn and my Twitter. I always like to connect with the community, and thank you so much for having me. It has been a super interesting discussion about topics I love. So I had a great time.
That's been great. Well, I'll put your links in the show notes below. Gisela, thank you very much for your time, and we'll speak again soon.
Bye.
Thank you. You've been listening to the Product Development Podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a rating and a follow on your preferred podcast platform, and I'll see you in the next episode.